Sign it, Lena, or I swear to God you'll leave this ranch with nothing but the clothes on your back." Her father's voice cracked like a whip across the silence. Lena's hand trembled over the paper that would sign away every acre she had bled, for every sunrise she had earned. And in that moment, she looked up not at her father, but at the stranger standing in the doorway. Dawson Hale. The man she was never supposed to meet. The man who was about to change everything. If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe to our channel, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lena Cross's life split in two. The sky outside was the color of a bad promise, pale flat and offering nothing. She had been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, because the cattle didn't care what hour it was, and neither did the work. She had pulled on her boots in the dark, moved through the barn with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from 15 years of doing exactly this: feeding, checking, calculating, managing. While her sister Eliza slept until 9 and wore clean dresses to breakfast, Lena had been in the mud since sunrise, running numbers in her head, watching the fence line on the eastern pasture that needed repairing before the rains came. She loved this land. That was the unbearable truth of it. She loved it the way you love something that never quite loves you back, fiercely, desperately, with the full knowledge that the feeling might not be returned. And then her father called her into the study. Marcus Cross was not a man who softened things. He never had been. He had built the Cross Ranch from almost nothing, from dry land, and borrowed money and the kind of stubborn fury that either makes men great or breaks them completely. In Marcus's case, it had done both. He was great in the way that big stones are great, immovable, imposing, and utterly indifferent to anything softer than themselves. "Sit down," he said without looking up from the papers on his desk. Lena sat. She noticed the papers immediately, not because they were unusual, but because of the way her father's hand rested over them, like he was keeping them from flying away. Or like he was keeping her from seeing them too soon. "There's been a development," Marcus said. "What kind of development?" "The good kind. For this family." He finally looked up, and his eyes, gray and flat as creek stones, settled on her face with the expression she had come to recognize over 31 years. The expression that meant a decision had already been made, and this conversation was not a negotiation. It was a notification. "The Hale family has approached me," he said. "Dawson Hale. You know who that is. Everyone knows who that is." Dawson Hale was the only son of the late Edmund Hale, who had built the largest cattle empire in the entire valley, 3 times the size of Cross Ranch, with water rights that made him effectively a king in a land where water was more valuable than gold. Edmund had died 2 years ago, leaving Dawson to manage an inheritance so vast it was almost a burden. Almost. What does he want? He wants a wife. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. "Eliza," Lena said. Not a question. She already knew. Eliza was the beautiful one, the gracious one, the daughter Marcus Cross had spent 28 years grooming for exactly this kind of alliance. This was what Eliza had been prepared for. This was the plan. "Eliza," Marcus confirmed. He slid a document across the desk. "And in exchange for the marriage alliance, the Hale family has agreed to forgive the debt we owe on the eastern parcels. But there's a condition." Lena looked at the document. Her eyes moved down the page quickly. She had always been a fast reader, a faster thinker, and within 15 seconds she understood what she was looking at. It was a transfer of ownership. Of her share of the ranch. Not Eliza's share. Not the family's collective assets. Specifically, surgically, the 30% that Lena had been promised in writing by her grandfather before he died, the 30% that represented the eastern pastures, the new water access rights she had personally negotiated 2 years ago, and the breeding stock she had built from almost nothing over the course of a decade, her 30%. "No," she said. The word came out quiet and absolutely certain, the way truly dangerous things often arrive without fanfare, without warning. Marcus's jaw tightened. "This isn't a discussion, Lena. You're asking me to sign away everything grandfather left me, everything I built. to fund Eliza's marriage to a man she's never met. I'm asking you to act like a member of this family instead of a hired hand who thinks she owns the place." The cruelty of it landed precisely where he intended. Lena absorbed it the way she had learned to absorb most of his cruelties without flinching visibly, while something inside her went very still and very cold. "Eliza doesn't even want this," Lena said. "She told me last week that she doesn't want to marry someone she's never spoken to. She's terrified. Eliza will adjust. She's your daughter. So are you." Marcus stood up from his desk, and the authority he carried with his body, the sheer physical weight of decades of being obeyed, filled the room. "And as my daughter, you will sign that document, or I will see to it personally that your grandfather's bequest is challenged in court on grounds that would make it very difficult for you to win. I have lawyers, Lena. Good ones, and I have patience." She stared at him. 31 years of this man. 31 years of being the capable one, the reliable one, the one who never needed anything, the one who was useful rather than treasured. 31 years of watching her value be measured in what she could produce rather than who she was. "Sign it," he said, "or you'll leave this ranch with nothing but the clothes on your back." And that was the moment, not dramatic, not theatrical, just clean and terrible and final, when Lena Cross decided. She pushed the document back across the desk. "No," she said again. And this time, the word was not quiet. This time, it had weight. She didn't hear the front door open. She was too focused on her father's face, watching the color rise in it, watching the controlled fury that she had feared her entire childhood begin to show itself at the edges. "You think this is about what you want?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was worse than shouting. "You think any of this is about you?" "I think you're making a mistake," Lena said. "I think you're selling this family's real strength. The land, the water rights, the breeding program I built to buy a social alliance that Eliza doesn't want and that we don't need. We need the eastern pastures. We need the water access. Those are mine, and I earned them, and I will not sign them over, so you can play politics with a man who already has more money than God." "That man," said a voice from the doorway, "would appreciate being left out of this particular metaphor." Both of them turned. Dawson Hale was not what Lena had expected, and she was immediately annoyed at herself for having expected anything at all. She had constructed an image from rumor and reputation, arrogant perhaps, or polished in the way that inherited wealth tends to polish people smooth and reflective, and without real depth. She had been prepared for a certain kind of man. She had not been prepared for this one. He was tall in the way that suggested real work, rather than mere genetics. The kind of tall that came with broad shoulders and a stillness of bearing that spoke of someone who had learned not to waste movement. His face was weathered without being hard, and his eyes, dark brown, nearly black in the morning light, were doing something she hadn't anticipated. They were paying attention, not to her father, to her. "Mr. Hale?" Marcus moved around the desk immediately, his entire demeanor shifting in the way that always made Lena feel slightly sick, the performance of deference from a man who deferred to almost no one. "I apologize, I didn't realize you'd arrived." "I came early," Dawson said. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was still looking at Lena. "I tend to do that. Better to see things as they actually are than as people have had time to arrange them." He paused. "You must be the other daughter." "Lena," she said, because she refused to be the other daughter in her own home, in her own study, in the middle of a conversation about her own property. Lena Cross. "I know who you are," Dawson said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "You negotiated the Millbrook water rights 18 months ago. 3 other ranchers had been trying for 6 years. You got it done in 8 weeks. Lena blinked. Of all the things she had been prepared for him to say, that was not among them. "That's right," she said carefully. "I've been trying to understand how you did it. Nobody would tell me." "Because nobody else knew. I did it alone." Dawson Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus Cross. And something in the quality of his attention changed, sharpened the way a man's attention sharpens when he realizes the situation he's walked into is not the situation he was told he would be walking into. "Marcus," he said, "would you give us a moment?" Marcus Cross blinked. In 30 years of building an empire, very few people had ever walked into his study and asked him to leave it. The shock of it was almost physical. This is my... a moment," Dawson said again, pleasantly, absolutely, in a tone that made it clear it was not a request. Marcus left. Lena stared at the closed door for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to Dawson Hale and said, "Whatever you're about to propose, the answer is no. I've already said no once this morning, and I'm getting better at it." He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't get defensive or charming or smooth. He tilted his head slightly the way someone does when they're genuinely thinking, and said, "What did he ask you to sign?" "My share of this ranch, the part that's actually worth something. In exchange for funding the alliance between your family and mine, specifically your marriage to my sister." Dawson was quiet for a moment. "Your sister," he said. "Eliza." "Yes." "I've met Eliza," Dawson said. "Twice. She's lovely. She's also terrified of horses, has no interest in ranching, and fainted during a cattle drive we drove past 2 summers ago." He paused. "I need a partner, Miss Cross, not a decoration." The silence in the room changed quality. "What are you saying?" Lena asked. "I'm saying I walked in here to discuss one arrangement," Dawson said, "and I think I might be walking out with a different one." He met her eyes, and there was nothing evasive in his gaze, nothing hidden, which she found both unusual and unsettling in a man of his position. "Marry me instead." If Lena Cross had been a different kind of woman, the kind her father had always wanted her to be, she might have gasped, or blushed, or deferred immediately to the flattery implicit in being chosen over her younger, prettier sister. She was not that kind of woman. "You're serious," she said. "Generally." "You don't know me. I know your work. I know what you built here. I know you told your father no to his face 5 minutes ago, when every other person in this valley would have nodded and smiled and signed whatever he put in front of them." Dawson's voice was measured, but underneath the measurement, she could hear something genuine, a kind of urgency, controlled but real. "I've been trying to run 300,000 acres of the most contentious land in the territory for 2 years, and what I need more than anything is someone who can look at a bad deal and say no without flinching. I just watched you do it." "A business arrangement," Lena said slowly. "A partnership." "Those aren't always the same thing." "No," Dawson agreed. "But they can be." She studied him. In her experience, men who offered things always wanted something in return that they hadn't mentioned yet. There was always a hidden condition, a buried clause, a secondary agenda that only revealed itself after you'd already committed. Her father had taught her that, if nothing else. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. "Genuinely, not the polished version. What do you actually need that you think I can provide?" Dawson was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense he was deciding how honest to be, and then deciding to be fully honest, which was not a choice she had seen many men make. "My father ran the Hale Empire through fear," he said. "Intimidation leverage favors ode. It worked for 30 years. But the men who managed things for him, the foremen, the land agents, the cattle buyers, they were loyal to him, not to the land, not to the work. Most of them have already started to test me. I have a cattle drive in 6 weeks that 3 of my senior foremen are actively undermining. I have a water rights dispute in the Northern Valley that's about to go to litigation because someone on my own payroll leaked information to the opposing party." He stopped. "I need someone who isn't inside the existing power structure. Someone with her own authority, her own judgment, and the courage to act on it. And I need that person to be in a position where my men can't dismiss her." "A wife can be dismissed," Lena said. "A wife with full co-signing authority on every Hale Ranch decision cannot." He reached into his coat and placed a document on the desk, not the one her father had left, a different one, his own, and slid it toward her. "I had this drawn up last week. I didn't know who it would be for. I knew what I needed." She looked at the document. Full partnership, equal authority. Her name beside his on every title, every contract, every decision. Her own income, separate and guaranteed. And a clause, a specific legally binding clause, that stated that in the event of dissolution, every asset she brought to the marriage and every asset she personally developed afterward would remain entirely hers. It was the most fair contract she had ever seen, which meant there was something wrong with it that she couldn't see yet. Why would you give this to anyone? She asked. This is your family's empire. You're giving half of it away on the basis of a 30-minute conversation. I'm giving half of the authority to someone who I believe will use it better than I can alone, Dawson said. The empire doesn't shrink because two people are running it instead of one. It grows. At least that's the theory. What if you're wrong about me? What if you're wrong about yourself? She looked up from the document. He was watching her with those dark, patient eyes, and she realized that whatever she had expected from Dawson Hale, she had not expected to feel seen. It was disorienting. The way sunlight is disorienting when you've been in a dark room, not unpleasant but requiring adjustment. I have conditions, she said. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. My cattle, my breeding stock, everything I've built here comes with me, and it stays mine regardless of what happens. Agreed. I won't be managed. If I make a decision in our operations, it stands unless you can give me a specific operational reason to reconsider, not a social reason, not a that's not how it's done here reason, a real reason. Agreed. And my sister is left out of this completely. No alliance, no arrangement, no pressure on her of any kind. Dawson nodded once. Eliza Cross is not part of this conversation and never should have been. Lena looked at the document one more time. Then she looked at the man across from her, this stranger who had walked into her crisis and offered her a door she hadn't known existed. She was not naive enough to believe there were no costs she couldn't see yet. She was not romantic enough to mistake a practical offer for something more than it was. But she was smart enough to recognize that what was on the table was real, that the authority being offered was genuine, that the contract was sound, and that for the first time in 31 years, someone was looking at what she could actually do and saying, yes, I want that. She picked up the pen. The door opened behind them, and Marcus Cross came back in, which was clearly earlier than Dawson had intended. And in the half-second before Marcus registered what was happening, Lena signed her name at the bottom of Dawson Hale's document. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. What? Marcus stopped. Looked at the paper, looked at Dawson, looked at his daughter's face, which was for the first time in a very long time completely calm. What is this? A change of plans, Dawson said. You were here for Eliza. I was here for a partnership. I found one. Dawson picked up the signed document, folded it, and placed it inside his coat with the ease of a man who was already somewhere else in his mind, already thinking about the next thing. The drive, the dispute, the work that needed doing. Lena will be coming with me at the end of the week to begin the transition. She'll need time to arrange her cattle. Marcus turned to Lena, and in his face, beneath the fury, beneath the calculations already recalculating, she saw something she had not expected. Not hurt, exactly. Marcus Cross was not a man who experienced hurt in ways he would acknowledge, but something close to shock. The shock of realizing that the piece he had always treated as the least significant had just moved on the board in a way he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. You have nothing, he said quietly to her. Without this family. I have a partnership agreement with the Hale estate, Lena said, and my cattle, and 15 years of knowing how to do the work. She stood up. She was surprised by how steady her legs were. She had expected to feel something like fear. Instead, she felt something that it took her a moment to name, because it was unfamiliar enough to require identification. She felt free. You'll regret this, Marcus said. Maybe, she said. But it'll be my regret. That's new. She walked out of the study without looking back. Eliza found her in the barn an hour later, which was where Lena always went when she needed to think, surrounded by animals who didn't care about politics or inheritance, or the complicated mathematics of family loyalty. Is it true? Eliza said. She was out of breath like she'd run from the house. Her dress was still clean. She was still in all the ways their father had designed her to be exactly what she had been prepared to be. "Papa said you—" "I signed a contract with Dawson Hale," Lena said. She was checking the hooves on her best breeding mare, keeping her hands busy. "We're getting married at the end of the month if the legal arrangements go through in time." "Married," Eliza repeated. "Lena, you don't have to anymore. Whatever you were afraid of, it's done." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed the barn floor and hugged her sister from behind, arms around Lena's waist. Face pressed between her shoulder blades, the way she used to do when they were children, and the world was frightening. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "You don't even know him." "I know enough," Lena said. "What do you know?" Lena thought about it, about the document, the eyes, the specific way he had said, "I need a partner, not a decoration." About the clarity of his offer and the unusual disorienting experience of being accurately seen by a stranger. "I know he looked at what I can do," she said, "and didn't try to make it smaller." She paused. "That's more than most people have ever done." Eliza held on for another moment. Then she let go and straightened up and looked at her sister with something that was equal parts fear and love and reluctant admiration. "He's not wrong about you," Eliza said softly. Lena went back to the mare's hooves. "No," she said. "He's not." 3 days later, when Lena Cross loaded her cattle onto the transport and climbed onto her horse to ride to the Hale Ranch, she did not look back at the house. She had said goodbye to Eliza, long quiet, full of the things sisters say without saying them. She had not said goodbye to her father. There was nothing left to say. What she didn't know as she rode toward the horizon with everything she owned and everything she was that behind her, Marcus Cross was already on the telephone. Already calling in favors. Already setting into motion a machinery of opposition and sabotage that would take weeks to reveal itself. What she also didn't know was that riding ahead of her, having left the Cross property 30 minutes earlier without fanfare, Dawson Hale was on the same road, and that one of the 3 foremen he had mentioned, the one he trusted least, was watching them both from a ridge half a mile north with a very particular kind of attention. The kind that precedes a move. The silent plain stretched in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the way land is before people write their ambitions into it. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence, 2 strangers were riding toward a life they had both just agreed to, without fully understanding what it would cost them. The wind was the only witness, and it didn't offer any promises. The Hale Ranch did not welcome her. That was the first thing Lena understood when she rode through the main gate and felt the weight of every pair of eyes on the property turn in her direction, not curious, not warm, but measuring. Calculating. The kind of attention that precedes a verdict. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how fast it would start. She hadn't even dismounted when the first one came at her. Not physically, nothing so direct. It was Hector Briggs, the senior foreman, a man in his mid-50s, with the build of someone who had spent his whole life outdoors, and the expression of someone who had spent his whole life resenting authority he didn't personally hold. He walked up to her horse, looked up at her with flat eyes, and said, "Ma'am, the housekeeper will show you to your rooms. The ranch business will handle that ourselves. Not welcome, not glad you're here." Straight to the boundary drawing before she'd had both feet on the ground. Lena looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. Before I settle in, I'd like to see the Eastern cattle records for the last 6 weeks. Bring them to the main office by noon." Briggs blinked. "Those records are—" "By noon," she said pleasantly, and handed her reins to the nearest stable hand, as if the conversation were already over. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. But the first move had been made, and it had been hers. Dawson was waiting for her on the front steps, and she could tell from his expression that he'd watched the whole exchange. He didn't say anything immediately. He just held the door open, and when she walked past him, he said quietly, "That's going to cost you." "Everything worth doing costs something," she said. He almost smiled. She noticed that about him in those first days, the almost smiles, the way genuine amusement showed up on his face like something he wasn't entirely sure he was permitted. She filed it away and didn't comment on it. Inside, he showed her the operations room maps, ledgers, correspondence, stacked in organized chaos on a table that clearly hadn't been properly managed since his father died. She looked at it for 30 seconds and then looked at him. How long has it been like this? About 2 years. And Briggs has been handling the day-to-day in the meantime. He has. So he knows where everything is and I don't, and I just demanded records from him in front of his crew. She processed this. Smart opening move on my part. I was going to say that yes. Don't. She pulled off her riding gloves and moved to the table. I made the move because I needed to establish that I'm not walking in here as a guest. I knew what it would cost. Now show me what I actually need to know to make it survivable. He pulled up a chair across from her and began to talk. She learned fast. She had always learned fast. It was perhaps the most useful thing about her, this capacity to absorb information and sort it into order without needing it, repeated. Dawson was a good teacher, which surprised her slightly. He didn't condescend. He didn't over-explain. He told her what she needed and waited to see what she did with it, and when she asked questions, sharp, specific operational questions, she could see him registering each one with something that looked very much like relief. Your Northern Water Rights dispute, she said somewhere around the second hour. You said someone on your payroll leaked information to the opposing party. Do you know who? I have a suspicion. Briggs. He was quiet. Not Briggs, she said, reading his silence. Someone Briggs is protecting. I can't prove it yet. You don't need to prove it yet. You need to know it. She looked at the correspondence files from the past 6 months. Which of your cattle buyers has had the most contact with the Alderman family in the last year? The Aldermans were the opposing party in the water dispute, a family with money connections and a very particular grudge against the Hale estate going back 15 years. Dawson went still. How did you know the Aldermans were involved? I didn't. I do now. She watched his face carefully. Who is it? Ray Cutter. He's been our primary buyer for Eastern District cattle for 11 years. And you trust him? I did. Does Briggs know Cutter socially? Dawson stood up from his chair, moved to the window, and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She gave him the moment. Some things need a second to land properly before you can respond to them usefully. They grew up together, he said finally. Same town, 40 miles east. So when I asked Briggs for the Eastern cattle records, Lena said, I was asking the man who is almost certainly protecting the person who is leaking your information to give me the documentation that might help me find the leak. The silence was significant. Well, Dawson said, turning back around. Welcome to the Hale Ranch. She picked up a ledger. I'm going to need the records anyway. The fact that he knows I want them is actually useful. It tells us how fast the information moves and in which direction. Watch who Briggs talks to between now and noon. Dawson looked at her with those dark eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, You've been here 3 hours. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's the opposite of a problem. And this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and slightly surprised, like he hadn't intended it. I'll watch Briggs. The records arrived at 11:47, 13 minutes early. She made a note of that too. Briggs had clearly spent those hours deciding that compliance was smarter than defiance for now. The records were complete, organized, and placed on her desk by a young ranch hand named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 19 and who looked at her with a combination of nerves and naked curiosity that she found almost charming in its honesty. Mr. Briggs says these are everything you asked for, ma'am, Tommy said. Thank you. Are you assigned to the Eastern section? Yes, ma'am, since March. Good. I may have questions for you later. You can tell Mr. Briggs I said that. Tommy nodded, started to leave, then stopped. Ma'am, for what it's worth. He hesitated, clearly weighing something. Most of us, the younger ones, we heard what you did. The water rights on the Cross Ranch. We heard you figured out something nobody else could. Another hesitation. Mr. Hale needs someone like that. We all do. He left before she could respond to it, which was probably wise on his part because she wasn't sure what she would have said. She sat with it for a moment, the unexpected, unpracticed honesty of it, and then she went back to the ledgers. 3 hours later, she found the first discrepancy. It wasn't huge. It wasn't meant to be huge. It was the kind of discrepancy that a man reviewing 200 pages of cattle records might easily miss or might see and attribute to simple error. A count that didn't quite reconcile between two dates. A number of cattle logged as transported that didn't match the number logged as received at the destination. The gap was small enough to be a mistake. It was also exactly 40 head of prime breeding stock, which at current market value was not a small amount of money. She sat back in her chair. 40 head, over 6 weeks, systematically. Someone wasn't just leaking information, someone was stealing. She found Dawson in the barn. He had gone back to working because she was already beginning to understand that work was how he managed stress, the same way it was for her. He was repairing a bridle with focused, methodical attention when she walked in and said without preamble, "You have a theft problem." He set down the bridle. "Show me." She showed him. He went through the numbers twice slowly, with the kind of careful attention that meant he was also checking her work. Not distrustfully, she understood that, but because a man who had been running an empire by himself for 2 years had learned not to take anything on faith until he'd verified it personally. 40 head, he said. At minimum. I only went back 6 weeks because that's what I was given. If this has been going on longer, it's been going on longer. His voice was flat. I knew something was wrong with the Eastern numbers. I couldn't find it. You were looking at the big picture. This was buried in the daily logs. He straightened up and she could see him working through the implications, the full cascade of it, the betrayal, the financial damage, the operational vulnerability. He was good at that. She was learning. He could hold multiple moving pieces in his mind simultaneously without losing track of any of them. It was a quality she respected because she shared it. Briggs, he said. Briggs is the cover. I don't think he's the one pulling the cattle. It would have to be someone with direct access to the transport records and the loading operations. Cutter. That's my guess. But we need proof before you move. If you move on Cutter without proof and Briggs closes ranks, I lose both of them and any loyalty that was still on the fence. He nodded. So how do we get proof? She had been thinking about this since she found the discrepancy. You have a transport scheduled in 4 days. Eastern Section 20, head to the Dalton buyers. Yes. Don't change anything about it. Let it proceed exactly as planned. But I want to ride with the transport personally. He looked at her. If Cutter or Briggs figure out what you're doing, then I'll deal with that when it happens. But if I'm there and the numbers don't add up at delivery, we have documented witnessed proof of the discrepancy. And you'll have me as the witness, your wife, with co-signing authority on every Hale operation. That's not someone they can dismiss or discredit quietly. Dawson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, This is dangerous, Lena. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of Miss Cross. She registered it, filed it away. I know, she said. Is that a reason not to do it? He picked up the bridle again, turned it over in his hands, then put it down. No, it's not. He met her eyes. But you should know what you're riding into. These aren't just dishonest employees. Cutter has connections to the Alderman family, which means there's money behind this beyond what he's skimming. If he knows he's been found out, he won't just run, he'll move. How? He'll try to discredit you before you can discredit him. And he has enough of a history here that people will listen. She understood what he was telling her. The threat wasn't just professional, it was personal. A woman who had appeared out of nowhere, married the boss, and immediately started overturning the order of things. She was the easiest target in the valley right now. All Cutter had to do was plant enough doubt, enough, whisper enough, carefully framed suggestion, and the story would write itself. She's the interloper. She's the one making trouble. Who is she really? Let him try, she said. Something shifted in Dawson's face. Not the almost smile this time. Something more serious. more searching the expression of a man who is revising an assessment in real time. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was an observation the way a scientist notes something unexpected in an experiment. "I'm afraid," she corrected. "I'm just not going to let that be the most important thing in the room." She held his gaze. "Are we doing this?" A beat. Then, "Yes, we're doing this." She nodded and turned to go. She had 3 days to prepare, and preparation was something she was very good at. She had made it to the barn door when his voice stopped her. "Lena." She turned back. "The water rights on the Cross Ranch," he said. "I asked around after I heard about it. 3 ranchers told me what you actually did, how you found the one legal provision that everyone else had missed, and used it to flip the entire negotiation." He paused. "I want you to know I'm not surprised you found the discrepancy in the ledgers. I just want you to know I'm grateful that you did." It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to hear. Not for a woman who had spent 15 years doing work that was absorbed into the family credit without ever being returned to her directly. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite trusting herself to respond, without sounding more moved than she wanted to sound in front of a man she had known for 4 days. "Thank you," she said finally. And then, because she was Lena Cross and she had never been able to leave a thing completely quiet. "Don't thank me until after the transport." She walked out into the afternoon. Behind her in the barn, she heard what might have been a quiet laugh, the first genuine one. She kept walking, but something in her chest did a thing she hadn't given it permission to do. She was going to have to watch that. The next 2 days moved fast, and underneath the surface of things like water under ice. On the outside, the ranch looked normal cattle fences, the ordinary machinery of an operation that size, grinding through its daily demands. But Lena was watching everything. She moved through the property with her clipboard, and her questions asking about feeding schedules and pasture rotations and transport logistics, careful to make it look like the general survey of a new co-owner getting her bearings rather than a targeted investigation. She was good at that, at making purposeful things look casual. It was a skill she had developed over years of doing real work in a household that preferred to see her as decorative. Tommy, the young hand from the eastern section, became a quiet, unofficial informant. Not because she recruited him, but because he was the kind of person who talked when he was nervous and was nervous around her, and therefore told her things without realizing he was doing it. She learned from him that Cutter had been to see Briggs twice in the past 48 hours. She learned that the conversation had been behind closed doors. She learned that afterward, Briggs had reassigned 2 of the loading crew from the upcoming transport men she didn't know replacements. She also didn't know. She told Dawson that night. He listened without interrupting. She appreciated that about him, this particular quality of attention. He didn't finish her sentences or talk over her or insert his own analysis before she'd finished giving him the information. He waited until she was done and then said, "He knows you're looking." Or he suspects, which amounts to the same thing for our purposes. "Then the transport isn't going to go the way we planned." "No," she agreed. "It's going to go better." She spread the original log records on the table between them. "He's going to make a move before we do. And when he does, I want to be in exactly the position he least expects, which means I need to be on that transport in a way that isn't announced, isn't official, and isn't explained to Briggs until after we leave." Dawson studied the map. "The transport goes through Callaway Pass before it hits the main road. There's a point where it slows down for the grade. Is there anyone you trust absolutely on this property?" "Not generally trust absolutely." He thought for a moment. "Jake Mercer. He's been with my family since I was 12. He worked directly for my father, but his loyalty was always to the land, not the man. He stayed when most of the old guard would have gone. I want to meet Jake Mercer. Tonight? Right now." Jake Mercer turned out to be a man of 60 with the kind of face that only gets that way from decades of keeping secrets and choosing words carefully. He shook Lena's hand without ceremony and looked at her with eyes that reminded her oddly of her grandfather, the same quality of seeing things clearly and not dressing up what he saw. "She's got her grandfather's handshake," he said to Dawson, apparently meaning it as a compliment. "Did you know my grandfather?" she asked. "Edward Cross. Knew him 20 years ago before Marcus took over. Good man, better man than his son." He looked at her steadily. "You're not like Marcus." "No," she said. "I'm not." "Then tell me what you need," she told him. He listened. He didn't blink. And when she was done, he said, "I can have 2 men I trust at Callaway Pass before dawn. They'll look like regular riders. They are regular riders, so that's not a performance. If Cutter or his people try to divert the transport before the pass, you'll know it. And if they try to divert it after, then you'll be there to see it yourself." He looked at Dawson. "You sure about her?" "Getting surer," Dawson said. Mercer almost smiled, the same almost smile that Dawson had, and she wondered if it was contagious or just something this land did to people made them cautious with their joy. "All right," he said. "I'll set it up." The night before the transport, Lena sat in the operations room alone at midnight, going through everything one more time. The numbers, the plan, the contingencies. She was thorough by nature, and she was particularly thorough when the stakes were high, and the stakes here were very high, not just for the cattle, not just for the legal case against Cutter, but for something larger and harder to name. This was her first real test in a place that hadn't wanted her. If she was wrong, if the plan fell apart, if Cutter was smarter than she had calculated, or Briggs moved faster than she anticipated, she would lose not just the credibility she hadn't yet fully built, but Dawson's trust, which she was beginning to understand mattered to her more than she had planned for. She hadn't planned for that. She heard footsteps in the hall, recognized them by now, the particular weight and rhythm of Dawson's walk, unhurried but purposeful. And then the door opened, and he was there carrying 2 cups of coffee, which he set on the table without being asked. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I couldn't." He sat across from her, the same way he had on the first day, and looked at the papers between them. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we can be." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked up. He rarely asked permission for anything. He was generally direct in the way of a man who had learned that directness was more efficient than maneuvering. The fact that he was asking permission meant the question was something he actually cared about the answer to. "Ask," she said. "Are you sorry you signed the contract?" The question sat in the air between them. The coffee steamed. The lamp on the table made everything seem closer than it was. "No," she said. "And she meant it not the way you mean something because you're trying to convince yourself, but the way you mean something you've already checked twice and found to be true." "Are you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "Not even a little." She looked back at her papers. He looked at his coffee. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was perhaps the most surprising thing. After 4 days in a strange place, surrounded by people who ranged from skeptical to actively hostile, the only place that had felt easy was across this table from this man she barely knew. She wasn't going to say that out loud, but she thought it. "Get some sleep," she said. "We ride at 4. He stood, picked up his coffee, and walked to the door. He paused. There she didn't see it, but she heard him pause, the specific quality of stillness that means someone is deciding whether to say one more thing. He decided. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I'm glad you said no to your father." She kept her eyes on the papers. "So am I," she said quietly. The door closed. The lamp flickered. And somewhere out on the dark plains, moving through the dark between where they were and where they needed to be, something was already in motion, and morning would tell them everything. They rode out at 4 in the morning, and the cold was the kind that gets into your bones before you've had time to object to it. Lena rode ahead of the transport with Jake Mercer on her left, and a man named Cole, one of Mercer's trusted 2, on her right. Dawson had positioned himself further back, visible enough to the transport crew to signal normalcy, close enough to move fast if things went sideways. The plan was simple in structure and complicated in execution, which was the only kind of plan that ever actually worked in Lena's experience. They had barely cleared the north fence line when Tommy appeared out of the pre-dawn dark on a horse that was breathing hard. He had ridden fast to catch them, and the urgency on his face was the kind that doesn't perform itself. "Miss Lena." He pulled up alongside her without ceremony. "Briggs left the property an hour ago. I don't know where he went, but he took one of the fast horses, and he didn't tell anyone he was going." Mercer looked at Lena. She looked at the road ahead. "How far to Cowboy Pass?" she asked. 40 minutes at this pace," Mercer said. 20 if we push." "Push," she said. They pushed. The transport fell behind intentional design exactly as planned. Let the transport move at its own pace. Let whoever was waiting at the pass think they had time. The riders arrived at Cowboy Pass with 12 minutes to spare, and what they found there confirmed everything. 2 wagons positioned sideways across the narrow section of the road, with 4 men standing beside them in the cold morning air, doing a very unconvincing impression of casual. Ray Cutter was not among them. Briggs was. Lena pulled her horse to a stop 10 feet from the blockade. Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized the situation is considerably worse than he was told it would be. He had clearly expected at most a confused transport crew. He had not expected Lena Cross, Jake Mercer, and 2 other riders appearing out of the dark 20 minutes before the transport arrived. "Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She had practiced for this moment by spending her whole life being told her presence was an inconvenience, and she had learned to make steadiness her answer to that. "Move the wagons." Briggs recovered faster than she expected. That was the first sign that he was smarter than she had given him credit for, which meant she needed to recalibrate quickly. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and the deliberate use of the title, the slight emphasis on it, was a move. "You're new here. Your authority is borrowed. Don't forget that. This road's blocked for maintenance. Transport'll have to reroute through the South Pass. The South Pass adds 4 hours to the route and goes directly past Alderman property," she said. "Which you know, which is why you chose it." Briggs's jaw tightened. "Maintenance." "There is no maintenance crew, Mr. Briggs. There are 4 men and 2 wagons and no tools, no equipment, and no work order, because I checked every work order filed in the last 2 weeks this morning before we rode out." She kept her eyes on him. "Move the wagons. Now." One of the men beside Briggs shifted his weight, a small movement, but Mercer saw it, and so did Cole. And the shift in their posture was automatic and immediate, and suddenly the quality of the standoff changed from verbal to something closer to physical. Briggs noticed. His calculation shifted visibly behind his eyes. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've walked into." "I have a very precise idea," she said. "You and Ray Cutter have been diverting cattle from the eastern section for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. The records show 40 head minimum. The transport this morning was designed to add to that count routed through the South Pass, so the delivery discrepancy would be attributed to alderman interference, and not to the people actually responsible." She tilted her head slightly. "Does that sound about right?" The silence was absolute. Even the horses went still. Then one of the 4 men by the wagons, young, not someone she recognized with the look of someone who had been paid to be here, rather than someone who believed in what he was doing, took a step back. Then another. Then he turned and walked away into the dark fast without a word. Briggs watched him go. And something in his face changed, the controlled authority cracking slightly at the edges, the first sign that the position he'd thought was solid was moving underneath him. "You can't prove any of that," he said. "I have the ledgers," she said. "I have the original transport logs with Cutter's signature. I have a signed statement from the Dalton buyers documenting every delivery shortfall for the past 2 months. She paused. "I have been very busy this week, Mr. Briggs." That last part wasn't entirely true. She had the ledgers and the logs. The signed statement from the Dalton buyers was something she intended to obtain today after the transport arrived. But Briggs didn't know what she had and didn't have, and the confidence with which she delivered the information was designed to make the complete package sound like a certainty rather than a work in progress. It worked. Briggs looked at the remaining 3 men. Then he looked at Mercer. Then he looked back at Lena, and in his expression, she saw the specific resignation of a man who has played a hand he thought was strong and discovered too late that the other player was holding something better. "Move the wagons," he said to his own men. They moved them. Lena rode through without looking back at Briggs. She couldn't afford to look back. Not because she wasn't watching him, she absolutely was watching him in every way except directly, but because the moment of victory, if that's what this was not the moment to show relief. Relief was private. Relief came later. Right now, she was still in the middle of something that had not finished moving. She heard hoofbeats behind her and knew without looking that it was Dawson who had seen the wagons move and come forward to meet her. "Briggs," he said, pulling up alongside her. "Handled, temporarily." She looked ahead at the road. "He'll run to Cutter. We have maybe 3 hours before Cutter knows it fell apart and decides what to do about it." "What will he do? Depends on how scared he is and who's backing him." She thought about what Dawson had told her, the alderman connection, the money behind it. If it's just Cutter and Briggs and this is about cattle theft, they'll scatter. But if the aldermans are actually involved, then this was never just about cattle, Dawson said. No, it wasn't. They looked at each other on horseback in the early morning light, and what passed between them was not romantic. It was the specific electricity of 2 people who are thinking the same thing at the same speed and recognizing each other in that which is its own kind of intimacy. "The water rights," Lena said. Yes, this wasn't about stealing cattle. The cattle was what funding leverage a way to destabilize the Hale finances, just enough that the water rights dispute looks more precarious. If the aldermans can demonstrate that the Hale estate is financially compromised, Dawson said, the court looks at the dispute differently. We look like a weakened party. They look like the stable one. So your own foreman has been systematically undermining your financial credibility for a land dispute that's worth 10 times the value of any cattle. She sat with that for a moment. How long has your family had those water rights? 30 years. And the aldermen claim, based on a survey from 1887 that my father successfully challenged in court in 1904. Did they accept the ruling? Publicly. His voice was flat. What they did privately is apparently what we're dealing with now. The transport came through the pass behind them intact, all 20 had accounted for. Tommy rode at the back, and when he passed Lena, he gave her a look that was somewhere between awe and pure relief. She gave him a nod and turned her horse back toward home. What she didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment of provisional victory, was that Ray Cutter had not gone to the pass. While Briggs had been blocking the road, Cutter had gone somewhere else entirely. And what he had done there was going to arrive at the Hale Ranch like a thunderclap in the middle of what should have been a quiet afternoon. They were back at the ranch by mid-morning. Dawson sent for the county legal counsel immediately. He wanted everything Lena had documented in front of a lawyer before Briggs or Cutter could move to counter-narrate it. Lena sat through 2 hours of that meeting with her ledgers and her logs spread on the table, answering questions in the precise documented way that left very little room for interpretation. And by the time it was over, the legal counsel, a careful, compact woman named Margaret Yates, who had represented the Hale family for 12 years, and had the expression of someone who had seen most things, looked across the table and said, "You found all of this in 6 days." 5, Lena said. Margaret looked at Dawson. "Where has she been?" "I'm working on that," Dawson said. Lena ignored both of them and put the ledgers back in order. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the writer came. He was from the alderman property. She didn't know that immediately, but she knew something was wrong by the speed with which he arrived and the way Dawson's expression changed when he read the note the writer handed him. The change was fast and controlled, and she had learned enough about his face in the past week to know that what she was seeing was anger being very forcefully managed. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the note. It was from Gerald Alderman himself, the patriarch, not a lawyer, not an intermediary. Handwritten, which meant it was personal rather than tactical. And what it said in the careful language of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment was that he was aware of irregularities in the Hale cattle records, and that he felt it was his civic duty to bring these to the attention of the county land board, along with certain questions about the legitimacy of the water rights claim that had been filed 30 years ago. Questions that he understood a recent examination of historical surveys might help resolve. Recent examination, which meant Cutter had gone to Alderman that morning with the information that the scheme had been discovered, and instead of running Alderman, had decided to accelerate. "He's going to file before we can," Lena said. "By the end of the week if we don't move first." "What does the original 1904 ruling rest on?" "A survey conducted by a man named Harlan Cross." Dawson stopped, looked at her. She looked at him. "Cross," she said. "That's my family. Your grandfather. Edward Cross." Dawson's voice was careful, watching her face. "He was the surveyor who established the boundary that the court used to uphold the Hale water rights in 1904. The room shifted slightly in Lena's perception, the way it does when something that seemed coincidental reveals itself to be structural. Her grandfather. Jake Mercer had known her grandfather. Good man. Better man than his son. Edward Cross had done the survey that protected the Hale water rights, and now she was here in the Hale house as Lena Hale, holding the ledgers that might protect those same rights 30 years later. "Did you know this?" she asked. "When you proposed the marriage, I knew your grandfather had worked with mine," Dawson said. "I didn't know about the survey until 2 weeks ago when I started pulling the historical records for the court case." He met her eyes directly. "It wasn't why I asked you. I want you to know that." She believed him. She wasn't sure why she believed him so completely and so quickly, but she did. It had something to do with the way he said things, the absence of performance in it. Dawson Hale was many things, but she had not once caught him being dishonest, and she had been paying close attention. "The original survey documents," she said. "Do you have them? My father filed copies. The originals should be—" He stopped. "Cross Ranch. The originals would have been in your grandfather's papers, which are now in my father's possession." Another silence, a significant one. "Your father," Dawson said, "who is already working against us." "Yes." "Do you think he knows about the survey?" Lena thought about Marcus Cross, the calculations behind his eyes, the way nothing was ever done without a secondary purpose. "I think," she said slowly, "that my father knew exactly what those papers were worth. And I think when I refused to sign his document and left with you instead, he started thinking about how to use them." The full shape of it assembled itself in the space between them, not quickly, but with the terrible clarity of something that was always going to be true, waiting only to be seen. Marcus Cross, Gerald Alderman. The timing of the cattle scheme. The timing of the marriage negotiation. The timing of everything. "Was this orchestrated?" she said. The words felt strange in her mouth. "The original approach to your family about Eliza was that—" "I don't know," Dawson said. And the honesty of not knowing, of admitting it rather than filling the space with false certainty, was the thing that made her trust him more than she already did. "But we need those survey documents." "I know," she said, "which means someone has to go to Cross Ranch." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I won't ask you to do that. You don't have to ask." She stood up, straightened her jacket, moved to the door. "I'll ride tomorrow morning. Alone." She paused. "Eliza will help me. She knows where grandfather's papers are kept. My father hasn't spoken to her directly about any of this. He never does. He considers her a social asset rather than a person, which is the one time his condescension works in our favor." "Lena." She turned back. "Be careful," he said. "I mean that." Something in the directness of it, the lack of decoration, the plain genuine concern moved through her in a way she hadn't braced for. She had spent 15 years on a ranch where her safety was a logistical concern, and her well-being was an afterthought. The simple fact of being told be careful by someone who visibly meant it as something more than courtesy did something to her she wasn't prepared for. "I will," she said, and then before she could think better of it, "I'm coming back." She didn't know why she said it. Or maybe she did, and that was the problem. He nodded. I know. She rode to Cross Ranch the next morning, and she brought Mercer with her, not because she needed protection, but because a witness was useful, and Mercer's presence said this is official business, in a language her father would understand. Marcus was standing in the yard when she arrived, which meant someone had told him she was coming. His face was the careful assembled face of a man who had spent the night preparing for this conversation. You look well, he said. The pleasantry of it under the circumstances was almost offensive. I need grandfather's survey papers, she said, dismounting. The 1904 Hale Boundary Survey. I need the originals. Marcus was quiet for 3 full seconds. Those papers belong to this family. Those papers were conducted by a member of this family in his professional capacity as a county surveyor. They document a legal boundary that the courts have already upheld and that are currently being challenged. If you are withholding them, I'm not withholding anything, Marcus said. I simply need to understand what they're being used for before I hand them to a man who has been my family's rival for 30 years. They're being used to protect a water rights ruling that your father, my grandfather, established legally and in good faith. She held his gaze. Or is there another reason you'd want to keep them? The question landed. She watched it land. Lena. Did you make a deal with Gerald Alderman? The silence that followed was its own answer. Not a confession. Marcus Cross would never confess to anything directly, but a silence with a shape to it, the shape of a man deciding how much to deny rather than whether to deny. You have no idea, he said quietly, how this valley works. The alliances, the history. I know that you sent me to sign away my inheritance to fund a marriage alliance that you were never going to let happen, she said. I know that the moment I refused and left with Dawson Hale, you started looking for leverage. I know those survey papers are leverage, and I know Gerald Alderman is why. She took one step closer to him. Whatever you promised him, whatever you're getting out of this, it's not worth what you think it is. Because I will get those documents, with or without you. And if it's without you, I will make sure that your role in undermining a legitimate court ruling is part of the public record. Marcus stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation. Something closer to the look of a man who is recognizing perhaps for the first time that the person standing in front of him is not who he thought she was. Eliza appeared in the doorway of the house. She looked at her father, she looked at Lena. Then she said calmly and clearly, The papers are in grandfather's trunk, second shelf. I'll get them. Marcus turned to her. Eliza. She's right, Papa, Eliza said. She's right about all of it. And she went inside. Marcus stood in the yard between his 2 daughters, one who had defied him, and one who had just chosen to, and the empire he had built on the assumption of their compliance shifted under him like ground that has been wet for too long. He said nothing. He let them go. On the ride back with the survey papers wrapped in oilcloth in Lena's saddlebag, Mercer rode beside her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, Your grandfather would have done the same thing. Gone to get the papers. Said she's right to a man like Marcus Cross. He paused. Your sister has more spine than people give her credit for. I know, Lena said. And she felt the truth of it, like warmth, like something returning to her that the morning's difficulty had temporarily taken away. They rode back fast, and the plains rolled out on both sides, enormous and unchanged, indifferent to the human complications moving across their surface. She had the papers. She had the evidence. She had enough to protect the water rights, enough to expose Cutter, enough to force Gerald Alderman to reconsider whatever move he was preparing. She had done what she came here to do. What she was not prepared for was arriving back at the ranch at dusk to find Dawson standing at the gate, waiting not in the agitated way of someone who has bad news, just standing watching the road, the way someone waits when they are simply waiting for a specific person to come back. And when she rode through the gate, and he looked up and their eyes met, something passed between them that had no business name and no strategic function and no place in a practical contract between two sensible adults. She dismounted. He came forward and took the reins without being asked, which was a small thing, a practical thing, and she handed them over and said, "I have the papers." "I know," he said. "Mercer sent a rider ahead." He paused. "How was it?" "Hard," she said honestly, "but done." He was standing very close because the gate was narrow and there wasn't much space, and she was tired in the way that's not physical but is carried in the chest, the specific exhaustion of doing something that cost more than you budgeted for it. She hadn't planned to show that. She had planned to be efficient and competent and forward-moving the way she always was. What she hadn't planned for was Dawson putting one hand against her jaw, not grabbing, not dramatic, just the lightest, most careful placement, the way you'd handle something you weren't sure you had the right to touch. And looking at her, with those dark eyes that she had been learning the language of for 6 days, and saying very quietly, "You don't have to be fine right now. We're not in front of anyone." And Lena Cross, who had been fine in front of everyone for 31 years, felt something in her chest give way, like a door that has been held shut too long finally opening. She kissed him, or he kissed her. Later, she would not be entirely certain which of them had moved first, because it happened in that particular way, where two people arrive at the same place, at the same moment, through different routes, and the destination is the only thing that matters. It was not a performance. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that happens when two people have been in close proximity under high pressure for 6 days, and have been very carefully not doing exactly this, and all that careful not doing finally ran out. When they separated, the plains were dark, and the first stars were out, and his hand was still against her jaw, and she was still holding the strap of her saddlebag, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dawson said low and slightly unsteady, "That wasn't in the contract." "No," she agreed. "Should I apologize?" She looked at him. "Do you want to, a beat?" "No." "Then don't." She walked past him toward the house, and her heart was doing something entirely unauthorized, and the plains stretched out behind her, silent and dark and enormous, and somewhere in the middle of all that silence, the thing that had been a practical arrangement between two sensible people had quietly, irrevocably become something else, something neither of them had planned for, something neither of them was going to be able to put back. Neither of them spoke about the kiss the next morning, not because it hadn't happened. It had happened completely, and both of them knew it had happened, but because the morning arrived with the specific urgency of a situation that had not paused to accommodate anyone's personal complications, and there was work to do, and they were both people who did the work first and processed the rest later. That was perhaps the most fundamental thing they had in common. Margaret Yates arrived at the ranch at 7 in the morning with 2 associates and a leather case full of documents, and by 7:15 they were all seated around the operations table, with the survey papers from Lena's saddlebag spread out under Margaret's careful hands. Margaret examined the original 1904 survey for 4 full minutes without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "These are in extraordinary condition." "My grandfather was meticulous," Lena said. "He was more than meticulous. These annotations." Margaret indicated specific marks in the margins, handwritten precise. "These correspond exactly to the boundary markers that Alderman's new survey claims were misrepresented. Your grandfather anticipated the challenge. He documented every decision point with its reasoning." She looked at Lena. "Did you know he did this?" "No," Lena said honestly. "I just knew where he kept his papers." "Well?" Margaret sat back. "What he kept in those papers is a preemptive rebuttal to every argument the Alderman claim rests on. It's as if he knew someone would try this eventually." She paused. "Or as if he knew the kind of people who might try it." Dawson, who had been standing near the window, said, "Can we file before the end of the week? If I work through the night, yes." Margaret began organizing the papers with efficient speed. "I'll need these originals. I'll give you certified copies before I leave." "Take what you need," Lena said. Margaret looked at her, a direct, assessing look that Lena had learned to recognize in capable women of a certain generation. The look that means I'm deciding whether you're the real thing. You found these in 24 hours, Margaret said. I knew where to look. You knew someone would need them. Yes. Margaret held her gaze for another moment, then nodded a single decisive nod that felt like something being settled permanently. I'll have the filing ready by Thursday, she said, and went back to her work. Dawson waited until Margaret and her associates had moved into the next room before he came to stand beside Lena at the table. He didn't say anything immediately, and she didn't look at him immediately, and the space between them had a quality to it that hadn't been there a week ago, charged, aware, careful in a new way. Cutter hasn't been seen since yesterday morning, he said finally. Operational, safe territory. He ran, she said. That's fine. Running is its own admission. Briggs hasn't left his quarters. Also fine. He's waiting to see which way this lands. She straightened the papers in front of her. When the filing goes through and the alderman claim gets buried under grandfather's documentation, Briggs will have to decide whether to stay and be managed or go. Either way, we need to restructure the foreman position before the next cattle drive. I agree. A pause. I was thinking Jake Mercer. Yes. She finally looked at him. He'll resist being called foreman. He'll say he's too old. He is too old. He's also the most trustworthy person on this property, and the only one with enough credibility among the older crew to hold the transition together. She tilted her head. Call it senior operations advisor. He'll accept that. Dawson looked at her with a particular expression, the one she had catalogued as genuine amusement he's not bothering to suppress. You've already thought this through. I think things through, she said. It's what I do. I know, he said. I'm not complaining. And then quieter. I'm the opposite of complaining. The thing that wasn't about cattle or legal filings moved through the space between them again, and Lena made a decision, the same kind of decision she always made when something important needed addressing, and said directly, Are we going to talk about last night? Dawson was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, not dismissive. Do you want to? I think we should understand what it means before it becomes a complication. Does it have to be a complication? She looked at him. In my experience, things that aren't named become complications. Things that are named become... She stopped searching for the right word. Manageable, he offered. I was going to say real, she said, but manageable works too. He turned to face her fully. Then here's what's real, he said. I have been trying very hard since approximately the second day you were here not to make this something you feel obligated to manage on top of everything else. This arrangement started as practical. I want it to stay practical if that's what you need it to be. He paused. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know what happened last night. And I'm not going to pretend it was incidental. Lena absorbed this. The specificity of it, the care with which he had constructed it, leaving room for her building the exit she might need while being honest about the fact that he didn't want to use it himself. It wasn't incidental, she said. Something in his face shifted relief, she thought, trying to disguise itself as neutrality. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. Neither of them moved. Neither of them elaborated. But the thing had been named now, which meant it was real, which meant it was something they would both have to carry forward consciously, rather than pretend wasn't there. For Lena, that was better. That was the only way she knew how to handle things that mattered, with both hands, eyes open, not set aside. The knock at the door broke the moment, and Tommy came in with the expression he always wore when he was bringing news he wasn't sure how to deliver. Mr. Hale, there's a rider from the Alderman property. He says Mr. Alderman wants a meeting. Dawson looked at Lena. Today, she said. This afternoon, at the Millbrook Hotel, neutral ground. Tommy hesitated. He's asking for Mr. Hale alone. The specific phrasing of it alone was a message. Lena heard it the way it was intended. This is men's business. Leave your wife at home. She had been hearing that message in one form or another her entire life. "Tell the writer," she said before Dawson could respond, "that Mr. and Mrs. Hale will be at the Millbrook Hotel at 2 o'clock. Tommy looked at Dawson. Dawson nodded once. Tommy went. "He's not going to like that," Dawson said. "He's not supposed to like it. He's supposed to understand what he's dealing with." She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "What does Gerald Alderman want more than the water rights?" Dawson considered. "Control. His family had control of this valley's water distribution before my father built the Hale Dam. He spent 30 years trying to get that back. So this isn't actually about the 1887 survey. That's the mechanism, not the motive." "No, it never was. Then the meeting isn't really about the legal case either." She thought about it rapidly, the way she sorted information quickly, without attachment to what she wanted, the answer to be only to what the answer actually was. He wants to negotiate. The survey papers spooked him. He wants to see if there's a deal to be made before Margaret files on Thursday. What kind of deal could he possibly think? "Water access," she said. "Controlled, structured, fair, but real. He's never had any. If we offer him a formal water-sharing agreement documented and binding, he loses the legal motive for the dispute entirely." She looked at Dawson. "Does that ruin something for you, giving him any access at all?" Dawson was quiet for a moment. She waited. This was his family's history, his father's empire. The thing that carried 30 years of weight she hadn't lived through. She was not going to rush him on it. "My father would say yes," Dawson said finally. "He'd say giving Alderman anything is weakness. He'd say you win by making sure the other man gets nothing." He paused. "My father also created the conditions that made Alderman desperate enough to bribe my foreman and steal my cattle. So maybe his strategy has some flaws." Lena said nothing. Let him finish the thought himself. "A fair water agreement," Dawson said slowly. "One that works for both properties without compromising our primary rights. I think I can structure something that does that. Give me an hour before we leave." He looked at her, that searching, revising look she had come to recognize. "You're going to walk into a meeting with Gerald Alderman and propose a solution he didn't know he was going to get. I'm going to walk in with a solution and let him think he helped design it," she corrected. "That's different. He needs to feel like he won something, or he'll fight the agreement just to save face." "How do you know that?" "Because it's what my father would do." She met his eyes. "I've been studying men like them my whole life. I know how they need to feel." The Millbrook Hotel meeting was not what Gerald Alderman had planned. He was a large man, Alderman not fat, but broad in the way of someone who had once been physically powerful and retained the architecture of it. He had the practiced authority of someone who had never walked into a room and been the least important person in it. When Lena walked in beside Dawson, she saw Alderman's eyes move to her and then hold there for a moment, recalculating, reassessing, and she recognized the specific look of a man deciding whether to acknowledge her as a factor or dismiss her as a gesture. She sat down at the table before he could decide. "Mr. Alderman, thank you for reaching out. I think this conversation is overdue." He looked at Dawson. Dawson looked back pleasantly. The message was clear. Answer her. Alderman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, I understood this meeting would be between the parties with authority to reach an agreement," Lena said. "That's both of us. Shall we begin?" She didn't wait. She opened the folder she had brought and placed a single document on the table. "I want to propose a cooperative water access framework. I think it solves the actual problem both our properties have been operating around for 30 years. Alderman looked at the document. He looked at it the way you look at something you weren't expecting, slightly off balance, trying to catch up. "You're offering water access. Structured, fair, legally binding. Primary rights remain with the Hale estate. That's non-negotiable because they were established lawfully, and we have documentation that will make that unambiguous in court. But secondary access for the Alderman Eastern Fields proportional to seasonal flow, guaranteed in writing." She slid the document slightly closer to him. "Your crops have been failing on the eastern side for 6 years because you don't have reliable water in July and August. This fixes that, permanently. Alderman stared at the document. Then he looked at Dawson, and this time Dawson spoke. "We're not interested in fighting you, Gerald. We never were. But we're also not going to lose what's ours because of a bad survey and a worse set of decisions." His voice was direct and without heat, which was sometimes more effective than anger. "Lena has put together something that works for both of us. Read it." Alderman read it. The table was very quiet. Lena watched his face with the kind of attention that doesn't show peripheral patient reading, the small movements that told her more than his words would. She saw the moment he understood what the document actually offered. She saw the moment he calculated what fighting it would cost him now that the survey papers were in play. She saw the moment he made his decision, which happened before he said a single word, and she knew what the word was going to be. "I'd need my lawyer to review the proportional access clause," he said. "Of course," she said. "We'd expect that. And the seasonal definitions would need to be more specific. We can work on that together. I'm available any day this week." He looked at her one more time, a long look, the kind that is also an acknowledgement, and said, "You're Edward Cross's granddaughter." "Yes. He surveyed my father's property once, in 1898. Fair man." He paused. "Didn't know Marcus had a daughter like you." "Most people didn't," she said, "including Marcus." Something shifted in Alderman's expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of dry recognition, the look of one pragmatist acknowledging another. He folded the document and put it in his coat. "I'll have my lawyer call yours by Friday." He left without drama, without theatrics, without the confrontation he had clearly arrived expecting. The chair across the table was empty. The folder was gone from the table, and Dawson sat beside her in the sudden quiet and said very low, "You just ended a 30-year land war in 40 minutes. "We ended it," she said. "You made him look at me. You made yourself worth looking at." She picked up her bag and her own copies of the documents. "Now we need to deal with Briggs." The Briggs situation resolved itself in a way she hadn't entirely predicted, which she took as a reminder that people were not ledgers. They didn't always balance the way logic suggested they should. Briggs came to find her. Not Dawson her. He came to the operations room the morning after the alderman meeting, knocked on the open door, and stood there with the particular posture of a man who has spent a long time being certain of his position and is no longer certain of it. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Mr. Briggs?" She didn't get up. She kept the deliberate asymmetry. She was at the desk, he was at the door, and that said something important about who held the authority in this room. "Do you want to sit down?" He sat. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance for a moment, like a man finding his words somewhere in the air between them. "Cutter told me it was sanctioned," he said. "The cattle." He said Mr. Hale the elder, before he passed, had an arrangement with the aldermans, that the diversions were part of an old agreement. "And you believed him." "I didn't disbelieve him." He looked at her directly. "Mr. Edmund Hale kept a lot of arrangements that he didn't write down. It wasn't unusual to be told something existed without seeing it on paper." Lena considered this. It had the texture of truth, not the truth of innocence, but the truth of a man who had made a bad choice and was trying to explain the conditions that made it feel like less of one. "Why didn't you come to Dawson when Cutter first approached you?" "Because I didn't think." He stopped. "Because I didn't think the new management would honor the old arrangements. And because Cutter said if I raised it, I'd look like I was questioning something that wasn't my business to question." "Which kept you quiet?" "Which kept me quiet." He said it flatly without self-pity, which she respected more than she expected to. "I'm not a stupid man, Mrs. Hale. I know how this looks." "How it looks," she said, "is like a man who was manipulated by someone smarter and more dishonest than he was, and who made the wrong choice because the right choice felt too risky." She paused. "That's not a rare situation. It's not a good one, but it's a human one." He looked at her. Whatever he had expected from this conversation, it wasn't this, not the absence of cruelty in it. "What happens now?" he said. "That depends," she said. "Jake Mercer is taking the senior operations role. If you can work under Mercer's structure genuinely, not performatively, then there's still a place for your knowledge of this property. You know these lands better than almost anyone alive. That's real value if you're willing to use it honestly." She held his eyes. "But the first time I have reason to question your honesty, you're done. That's not a threat. It's the only terms I'm able to offer." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded a slow, considered nod. "That's fair," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He left. Mercer, who had been in the hallway for reasons that were probably not coincidental, appeared in the doorway a moment later and looked at her with those careful eyes. "You let him stay." "His knowledge stays," she said. "His old authority is gone and he knows it. That's enough." She looked at Mercer. "Are you going to tell me I was too soft?" "No," Mercer said. "I'm going to tell you your grandfather would have done the same thing." He paused. "And that's the highest compliment I know how to give." The week that followed was the most operationally dense of Lena's life, which was saying something. The legal filing went through Thursday morning as Margaret had promised. By Thursday afternoon, the alderman lawyer had called not to fight to negotiate, which meant the filing had done exactly what it needed to do. By Friday, the cooperative water framework had a working second draft. By Saturday, the news had spread through the valley, the way news always spreads in small, interconnected communities, fast and slightly distorted, and impossible to contain. The reactions were varied. Some of the neighboring ranchers came to her directly, cautiously, carefully, in the way of people who are accustomed to a power structure and are recalibrating to a new one. A woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the smallest spread in the valley and had been squeezed by both the Hale and Alderman operations for years, arrived on horseback on Saturday afternoon and said without ceremony, "Is it true you got Alderman to agree to shared water?" "We're working on the formal agreement," Lena said. "It's not final. But it's real. It's real." Ruth Calloway looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something without being sure it would ever arrive. "My East Field has been dry every August for 11 years, she said. "If this water agreement goes through the way people are saying, if it's structured the way I heard—" "Come in," Lena said. "Tell me about your East Field." Ruth came in. She stayed for 2 hours. She left with a preliminary letter from Lena stating that the cooperative framework being developed between the Hale and Alderman estates could include additional valley properties if the terms were mutually acceptable. Dawson found Lena in the operations room at 10 that night, which was where he always found her when he needed to find her, surrounded by papers and working with the focus of someone who hadn't noticed the time. "Ruth Calloway came to see you," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "She's not the only one who will come." "No, I know." She set down her pen. "Is that a problem for you?" He sat across from her, the familiar position, the familiar table, the lamp between them. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned meant he was actually thinking, rather than composing something diplomatic. "My father built this empire by keeping everyone else small," he said. "He believed that the only way to stay powerful was to make sure nobody around you could match you. I watched him do it for 20 years, and I thought—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I thought that was just how it worked. That was the nature of it. And now?" she said softly. "Now I'm watching you offer Ruth Calloway something that costs us almost nothing and will make her loyal to this property for the rest of her life." He looked up. "And I'm thinking my father was wrong about almost everything except the cattle." Lena held his gaze. "The valley works better if the valley works together. The water is the same water regardless of who controls it. If we control it generously instead of fearfully, we become the kind of operation that people want to work with instead of the kind they're waiting to see fall." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I see it." He paused. "It took you 2 weeks to see what I've been trying to understand for 2 years." "You were alone," she said simply. "It's easier to see clearly when there are 2 sets of eyes." The lamp flickered between them. Outside the plains were dark and still, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out once and went quiet. "Lena," he said. The way he said her name had changed in the past week. She had noticed it without commenting on it, the way you notice a shift in weather before the weather arrives. There was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Something that was not professional, not contractual, not manageable. "I know," she said before he could continue. "You know what I'm going to say. I know what you're feeling," she said. "Because I'm feeling it too." She looked at him steadily. "And I'm not afraid of it. I want you to know that. For a few days I was afraid of it because it wasn't what I planned for, and I don't like being surprised by my own reactions. But I'm not afraid of it anymore." He reached across the table, slowly giving her time to move if she wanted to, and she didn't move. He put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a moment that had no operational significance and no strategic value, and was perhaps for those reasons the most important moment that had passed between them. "This is real," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. "It's real." Outside, the wind moved across the plains, and the grass bent and straightened, and the enormous patient dark held everything the way it always did. The cattle and the fences and the water and the land, and the two people inside the lit window who were without quite meaning to building something that neither one of them had ever had before. Something that was theirs, fully, completely without condition. The cooperative water agreement was signed on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every way except that it wasn't. Margaret Yates laid 3 copies on the table, one for the Hale estate, one for the Alderman family, one for the county land board, and Gerald Alderman signed his name beside Dawson's without theatrics. Without the hostility that had characterized 30 years of dispute, with the specific resignation of a man who has finally decided that what he can get is worth more than what he's been fighting for. When it was done, he looked across the table at Lena and said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." "I think so too," she said. He left without further ceremony. Margaret gathered her copies, gave Lena a look that said everything, without saying anything, and also left. And then it was just Lena and Dawson in the room, and the signed document between them, and the particular silence of something large, having just become permanent. "That's done," Dawson said. "That's done," she agreed. What neither of them said was that it was only one thing. That outside the walls of the Millbrook Hotel conference room, there were still moving pieces they hadn't fully accounted for, pieces that had been set in motion before they even knew a game was being played. The valley was quiet on the surface. But surfaces had been deceiving Lena her entire life, and she had learned not to trust them. The first sign that something was still wrong came from Eliza. She arrived at the Hale Ranch 3 days after the signing unannounced on a horse she had clearly ridden hard. And when Lena came out to meet her, Eliza's face had the particular look of someone who has been holding something in for as long as they possibly can and has finally run out of room to hold it. "Papa knows about the agreement," Eliza said before she even dismounted. "He's been on the telephone since Monday. I don't know who he's calling, but it's constant morning-night behind closed doors." She got down from the horse and grabbed Lena's arm. "He had a man here last week, Lena. Someone I'd never seen before. They were in the study for 2 hours, and when the man left, Papa burned something in the fireplace." Lena went very still. "What kind of man?" "Lawyer. Or he looked like a lawyer, but not the kind who works for ranchers. More like—" Eliza searched for the word. "Like someone who works for banks." The cold that moved through Lena's chest was not metaphorical. It was immediate and physical, and pointed directly at a possibility she had not yet fully considered. She had been so focused on Cutter, on Alderman, on the legal case, and the cattle, and the operational restructuring, that she had treated her father as a background threat, present, dangerous in the abstract, but not yet actively moving. She had underestimated Marcus Cross. Again. "Stay here," she told Eliza. "Don't go back tonight." She found Dawson in the barn, which was where he went when he was working through something he hadn't resolved yet. She had noticed this about him. The barn was his operations room when the problem wasn't operational. She had started to find it almost endearing, which told her something about how far they had come in 3 weeks. "My father is working on something," she said, and told him everything Eliza had said. Dawson listened with that particular quality of attention she had come to depend on. When she finished, He was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, and then said, "The debt." "What debt?" "The Cross Ranch debt. The eastern parcels, the reason your father wanted you to sign your inheritance away in the first place." He turned to face her fully. "If Marcus couldn't use you to clear the debt through the marriage alliance, and if he can't use the survey papers as leverage because we've already filed what's left." She thought about it rapidly. "The debt itself. If he defaults." "Who holds the note?" Dawson said. "On the Cross Ranch debt. Do you know?" She didn't. She had never needed to know. It had been her father's business managed by her father's lawyers kept behind the closed doors of a man who had never considered her a person who needed to be informed. A bank. He always said it was a regional bank, the Whitmore Trust. Whitmore Trust was bought out 18 months ago, Dawson said quietly. "I know because I was approached about the acquisition. I didn't buy it because I didn't want the liability exposure." He paused. "Gerald Alderman bought it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the barn. "Alderman owns the note on Cross Ranch," Lena said. "Not a question." Her voice was completely flat, the flatness of someone absorbing something that is almost too large to absorb quickly. "If Marcus defaults, or if Alderman calls the note early on a technicality, he takes Cross Ranch," she said. "The land, the water access, everything." She processed the full shape of it, and it was ugly in the way that genuinely clever schemes are ugly, not flashy, not theatrical, just structurally sound and quietly devastating. The cooperative water agreement doesn't give Alderman what he actually wanted. What he actually wanted was the cross property. The water dispute was a distraction. My father's debt was the real play all along. "And your father," Dawson said. "My father either knows and made a deal he thinks protects him, or he doesn't know and he's about to lose everything to a man he thought was his ally." She looked at Dawson. "Which one is it?" "I don't know," he said. "But we need to find out tonight." She called Margaret Yates from the ranch telephone at 9 o'clock in the evening. Margaret answered on the second ring, which told Lena that Margaret also did not stop working because the sun had gone down. She laid out what she knew: the Alderman acquisition of Whitmore Trust, the Cross Ranch debt, the timing, and Margaret listened without interrupting and then said in the tone of a woman reorganizing her entire understanding of a situation, "That's why he agreed to the water framework so easily." "Yes," Lena said. "He didn't need the water rights anymore. He needed us to think the dispute was settled so we'd stop looking at what he was actually doing." "Can we protect the cross property?" Lena thought about it. The instinct, the immediate visceral instinct, was to say, "That's not my problem." Marcus Cross had made his choices. He had tried to use her as a pawn, had allied himself with the man who was stealing from her husband's ranch, had burned documents in a fireplace rather than come to her honestly. He had built this situation himself, brick by careful brick, over years of decisions that prioritized his own power over everything else, including his own daughters. She thought about Eliza asleep in the guest room down the hall. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting in the margins of a 30-year-old survey, precise, careful, anticipating the challenges that were coming. She thought about what it meant to protect something that was worth protecting, even when the people inside it were complicated, even when the love was tangled up in damage and disappointment. "Can we buy the note?" she asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You'd be taking on Cross Ranch's debt." "I know. Can we buy it before Alderman moves on it?" "If Alderman hasn't already filed the call notice, and I don't believe he has because he'd want to wait until after the water agreement was finalized and public, so it looked unrelated, then yes. Technically the note is purchasable, but it would require Alderman to agree to sell it." "Why would he agree?" "He wouldn't," Margaret said, "unless you offered him something worth more than the cross property." Lena looked at Dawson, who had been standing close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. He looked back at her. And what passed between them in that look was not a question, it was a recognition. The same recognition from both directions arriving at the same place at the same moment. "The northern water access," Dawson said quietly. "The secondary channel. It's on Hale land. Alderman has wanted it for 20 years. My father refused every approach. It doesn't compromise our primary rights if we structure it correctly. He paused. If we offer him legal documented access to the Northern Channel in exchange for the cross note, he gets something he actually wanted for 20 years, Lena said. Something real and permanent, not a legal gamble. Margaret, Dawson said, leaning toward the telephone. Can you draft a note, purchase agreement tied to a secondary water access addendum to the cooperative framework? Tonight. A brief pause. Then, Mr. Hale, I have been your family's lawyer for 12 years, and I have never once said no to a reasonable request made at an unreasonable hour. Another pause. This is the first request that is also genuinely interesting. Give me until morning. The next day arrived with the specific quality of a day that is going to matter. Lena knew those days by the feeling of them, a tightness in the air, a clarity to everything, as if the world had sharpened itself overnight in preparation for what was coming. She told Eliza at breakfast, sat across from her sister at the kitchen table, and laid it out plainly. Alderman, the note, the Northern Channel offer all of it. Eliza listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her face doing the complicated thing it did when she was understanding something she wished she didn't have to understand. He knew, Eliza said when Lena finished. Not a question, not quite an accusation, something sadder than both. Papa knew Alderman had the note. I think he made a deal, Lena said. I think he agreed to help Alderman undermine the Hale water rights in exchange for Alderman not calling the note. What I don't know is whether Alderman ever actually intended to hold up his side. He didn't, Eliza said flatly. That's obvious. Yes. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at her sister with the expression she'd had in the doorway of the Cross Ranch house when she'd said, "She's right. Papa," clear a little sad, completely decided. Are you going to tell him before you approach Alderman? I have to, Lena said. He needs to know what's happening to his property, and he needs to consent to the note being purchased, even if... She stopped. Even if he doesn't deserve you doing it, Eliza said softly. Even then, Lena said, he's still our father. She drove to Cross Ranch that morning with Dawson beside her, which was not a statement she had planned to make. Bringing her husband to confront her father felt theatrical, potentially inflammatory. But Dawson had simply gotten into the vehicle without being asked, and when she'd looked at him, he'd said, "You're not doing this alone," in a tone that did not invite debate, and that she found, if she was honest, a relief so profound she almost said so out loud. Marcus was in the study. He always was. He looked up when they came in, and the look on his face when he saw them both together presenting a unified front that he clearly had not expected was the most honest thing she had seen on his face in 31 years. It was fear. Not the managed strategic fear of a man recalculating odds. Raw fear. The fear of a man who realizes the consequences of his choices have arrived before he finished preparing for them. Alderman has your note, Lena said. She didn't sit down. Neither did Dawson. He bought Whitmore Trust 18 months ago. Whatever deal you made with him, whatever you thought you were getting, he was never going to honor it. He wanted this land, and he's been moving toward taking it since before any of us started paying attention. Marcus stared at her. The color in his face moved through 3 different versions of itself. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. But it was reflexive, the denial of a man who knows exactly what she's talking about. We can buy the note, she said. Dawson and I. We have an arrangement with Alderman for the Northern Channel access in exchange. He gets something real. We get the note, you keep the ranch. She paused. But I need your consent to move forward. And I need your honesty right now about what you agreed to with Alderman and what documentation was in that fireplace. The silence in the study was total. Marcus Cross had built his entire identity on never being at the mercy of anyone. Certainly not his overlooked, underestimated, mud-covered oldest daughter. The cost of what she was offering was written all over his face. She would know everything. He would owe her. The power dynamic between them would shift permanently and irrevocably, and there was nothing he could do about it. He looked at Dawson. You're letting her lead this. She's leading it because she's the one who figured it out, Dawson said. And because she's the one who decided to help you when she had every reason not to. Another silence. Longer. Marcus Cross looked at his hands. And something happened on his face that she had never seen before, not softening exactly because Marcus was not a man who softened, but a kind of settling. A fatigue that was also underneath it something almost like relief. The relief of a man who has been holding a wall up for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to let it down. It was a survey amendment, he said. Alderman wanted me to find any historical documentation that could be used to question the 1904 boundary. I told him the original survey papers were in your grandfather's trunk. He stopped. I didn't know you'd already gotten them. What did he offer you? 5 years on the note, no interest. He looked up. It seemed I thought it was enough time to restructure the debt through the cattle revenue. But then I left, she said. And the cattle revenue you were counting on was the breeding stock I took with me. His jaw tightened, not in anger, she realized, in shame, which was different, which was possibly the first genuinely different thing she had ever seen on his face. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. 31 years of this man. 31 years of being capable and invisible and useful and overlooked. And here at the end of it, he was sitting behind his desk with the consequences of 31 years of bad choices assembled in front of him. And she was the one holding the solution. She had thought sometimes about what it would feel like to have this kind of power over him. She had thought it might feel like vindication. It didn't. It felt like something considerably heavier, considerably quieter. It felt like responsibility. Sign the consent document, she said. Let us buy the note. Keep your ranch. She paused. And when this is done, when you're not at risk of losing everything, I want you to think about what Eliza needs. Not what she can do for this family, what she needs. Marcus looked at her. Then he picked up the pen. Margaret called at noon to confirm that Alderman had accepted the Northern Channel addendum. The note purchase was filed by 2 o'clock. By 4, the Cross Ranch debt had a new holder, Lena and Dawson Hale, and the terms had been restructured to a reasonable repayment schedule that Marcus Cross, if he managed his operation with the basic competence it required, could meet. Eliza cried when Lena told her. Not dramatically quietly, the way Eliza did most things that actually mattered to her, with her hand over her mouth and her eyes bright. You didn't have to, she said. I know. He didn't deserve. I know that too. Lena took her sister's hand. But you do, and the land does. Grandfather's land, it doesn't deserve to end up in Alderman's hands because Papa made bad decisions. She squeezed Eliza's hand. It's done now. It's settled. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the Hale Ranch, there was nothing urgent. No filing deadline, no confrontation pending, no crisis assembling itself in the dark. The operation was sound. Mercer was running the crew with the quiet authority of a man who had been waiting 20 years to do it properly. The cattle drive had gone off without incident. The cooperative framework was signed. The legal case was closed. The valley had not transformed overnight into something peaceful and uncomplicated. The world didn't work that way, and she knew it, but the immediate machinery of crisis had for the moment gone still. Dawson found her outside, which was where she had gone, because the stillness felt strange indoors, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. She was standing near the fence line at the edge of the property, where the ranch light ended, and the plains began looking at the enormous patient dark. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. She appreciated that about him, this quality of being able to be present without filling the space with words. It was rarer than it should have been. Are you all right? He said finally. I don't know, she said honestly. I think so. I think I'm just adjusting to what it feels like when things are actually okay. Is that hard? Surprisingly. She looked out at the plains. I spent so long in a state of having to fight for everything that I'm not entirely sure what to do when I don't have to fight. He turned to look at her profile, and she could feel the weight of his attention the way she always could now, warm, specific, real. You could rest, he said. She almost laughed. I don't know how. I know. She heard something like affection in it, not condescending, not corrective, just true. We could figure it out together. I'm not much better at it than you are. She turned to look at him. In the dark, with the plains behind him and the ranch light behind her, he looked like the man she had met in her father's study 3 weeks ago. Imposing still, the bearer of an authority that went all the way down, and also nothing like that man at all. He had changed in 3 weeks, or she had changed in 3 weeks, or they had changed each other. And the result was this: a man she trusted completely, standing in the dark beside her, offering to learn something difficult alongside her, rather than telling her how to do it. I want to redo the marriage ceremony, she said. It came out without preamble, without the careful construction she usually applied to important things, which was how she knew it was the most honest thing she had said in some time. The legal one, the papers we signed, that's fine, that's done, but I want a real one. Here, on this land. She paused. In front of people who know what we actually built. Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then, Mercer will cry. He absolutely will. He'll deny it after. Eliza will organize everything within 48 hours of being asked. She'll love every minute of it. Margaret will give a speech no one asked her for. And it will be the best speech anyone gives. He smiled a full smile this time. Not the almost smile. Not the controlled acknowledgement of amusement, but the real one. The one she had been collecting instances of without meaning to, because each one felt like something found rather than given. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, slow and deliberate, and completely without agenda, and said, yes, let's do that. She kissed him. Not the way she had kissed him at the gate that had been relief and exhaustion, and something that needed to happen before it could be examined. This was different. This was chosen fully with both eyes open, and everything accounted for all the complications, and the costs, and the things that had no names yet, but were growing into their shapes in the space between them. When she pulled back, she looked at his face in the dark and said, I didn't plan for any of this. I know, he said. It's the best thing I ever didn't plan for. His hands were warm on her face, and the plains were dark and vast and utterly indifferent to the human lives being lived at their edge, and the wind moved through the grass the way it always had, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. The same wind that had been moving through the same grass for 1,000 years before them and would be moving through it long after. The ceremony happened on a Saturday, 3 weeks later, in the open air of the Hale property's southern field, with the plains visible in every direction, and the sky overhead doing the particular thing it did in that part of the country. Enormous, specific, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very real simultaneously. Ruth Calloway came. 3 other Valley ranchers came, ones who had started the slow, careful process of approaching Lena about the cooperative framework. Jake Mercer stood beside Dawson, and his face was, as predicted, not entirely dry, which he denied to anyone who mentioned it for the rest of his life. Eliza had indeed organized everything within 48 hours of being asked, and the result was simple and genuine and exactly right. Margaret gave a speech nobody requested, and it was, as also predicted, the best one. Marcus Cross came too. He arrived late, stood at the edge of the gathering, didn't speak to anyone immediately. Lena saw him from across the field when she was standing with Eliza waiting, and what she felt when she saw him was not the thing she might have expected, not anger, not the complicated ache of a relationship that had never been what it should have been. She felt something more like recognition. The recognition of a man who was seeing for the first time clearly, and without the distortion of his own need for control, what his daughter had built and who she had become. He didn't come to her. But at the end of the ceremony, when the gathered people were talking, and the afternoon light was going long and golden across the plains, he found Dawson standing alone for a moment by the fence and said something to him that was too quiet for anyone else to hear. Dawson listened. Then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that means something is being accepted rather than just acknowledged. Later, when the guests had gone and the field was quiet, and she and Dawson were sitting on the fence at the edge of the property, watching the last of the light leave the sky, She asked him what her father had said. Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then, he said she was always the one who should have been running things, that he knew it when she was 8 years old, and he spent 30 years pretending he didn't because it was easier than admitting it. He paused. Then he said he was sorry. Those were his exact words, "I'm sorry." Just that. Nothing after it. She sat with that for a long time. The plains went dark around them, slow and absolute, the way the dark always came in open country, not arriving, just deepening the way things deepen when they have all the space in the world to do it in. "Is it enough?" Dawson asked. He wasn't pushing. He genuinely wanted to know. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. It wasn't enough to fix 31 years. It wasn't enough to give back the time or the credit or the quiet accumulation of moments when she had been capable and invisible in the same breath. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that kind of sustained overlooking does to a person. But it was real. And it was his, which meant it had cost him something, which meant it was worth more than any amount of polished sentiment. "It's a start," she said. Dawson put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat together in the dark on the fence at the edge of everything they had built. The agreements, the trust, the restructured legacy, the cooperative framework that was already beginning to change. How the valley worked. The marriage that had started as a contract and become the realest thing either of them had ever signed their name to. The silent plains stretched in every direction, enormous and patient and unchanged. And on them, in the middle of all that silence, two people had built something that would outlast the silence itself, a partnership forged in fire and paperwork and cattle records, and one unplanned kiss at a gate in the dark, something that was stronger than what had tried to break it, something that was theirs fully and finally in body and heart and name. The wind moved, the grass bent, the stars came out one at a time over the plains, and Lena Hale, who had once been told she would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back, looked out at everything she had claimed, everything she had earned, everything she had built with her own hands, and her own courage, and the unexpected grace of a man who had seen her clearly from the very first moment. And she was in the truest and most complete sense of the word home.